Larry Krasner, a reformist DA. He was a defense attorney. He was elected, and let's pop up. And I've been reading these stories too, and I was getting a little bit concerned.
Right.
But pop up that tweet that shows all the series of articles that have been written, and this is also part. There is a look at this. New York Times. Can a progressive prosecutor survive a 40% spike in homicides? Keep scrolling through that. Did you have that other? Keep going through these. Hit fierce resistance. Our liberal cities turning against their progressive prosecutors. San Francisco, Philadelphia promised to overturn decade. A soft on crime backlash. Philadelphia Democrats declined to endorse progressive prosecutor. Keep going. I mean, there were so many of these stories. And Krasner wins his primary in there's no other word for it, massive landslide.
30 points.
I mean, that's amazing. Like, what is going on here? Like, this feels like an extension of the Democrats, of the narrative that came out of the 2020 election, which was, they're talking too much about this and that. And, even though we don't support it or whatever it is. I mean, what's going on there?
Well, in the case of Larry Krasner and this targeted wave of pro-police, hard-on crime propaganda that we see in our media, it seems as though obviously there's a genealogy on this going back to the 90s and the sort of broken windows. And so for me, the change is less in the kind of timbre and tone of the media and more in the willingness of certain Democrats, local at varying levels, maybe not up to the Senate or president, to resist what normally would lead them to shrink back and go, well, yeah, maybe we have to sort of signal to the right that we're hard on crime. Maybe the way to sort of get beyond this media narrative is to be harder on crime than we would theoretically want to be if you believe that their hand is being forced. I think now what we're seeing is, ultimately speaking, there is a larger gap between these narratives that the media are trying to push out there and what the people on the ground who are responsible for actually voting and supporting these people at the local level actually believe, right? We're seeing one thing being reported in the media where, are people in Philadelphia ready for a prosecutor that's easy on crime when there's a 50% spike in who knows, crack-related homicides in the ghetto, just obvious dog whistling towards, racialized crime narratives of the past, just, fall on deaf ears, because the people have lived through the results of those kinds of hard-on crime bills, those sort of hard-on-crime policies, and they've seen that A, it does not work. They've been either personally negatively affected by it, or B, the kind of experience they're talking about in the media does not actually, relate to what people are seeing in the streets, which is either a reduction in crime or police beating up Black people and old people and women and nuns. And so, it's, I guess for me, it's weird to see how stark this divide between the people who are theoretically out there representing, facts and news are, and the people who are actually voting for the politicians.
Yeah, and I wonder if there was any introspection, I didn't read the pieces, but just based on the headlines, about how the pandemic and the amount of instability and mental toll and also economic toll has created more crime. I mean, remember, this was what caused Representative Yoho to accost Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the steps, was because she connected crime to the economic fallout from COVID. And it seems like just because the media is interested in creating a counter narrative to Krasner and other DAs like him, they're going to push that aside, that very obvious connection, in order to say, well, I don't know, time for a devil's advocate piece that's part of a manufacturing consent operation that we're not going to necessarily be conscious of.
Yeah, it is weird. There is I think there's some of that, but I also do think that there is this sort of and look, most of those outlets that we wrote were that we showed there are sort of liberal.
New Republic.
Yeah. And I think that there is there is this sort of movement, and part of it comes from like sort of the I don't even know how to classify, the alt IDW, essentially, the Michael Tracy's and the Greenwalds and that ilk, where they want to push this narrative of the excesses of the moment, right? And part of the excesses are of, cancel culture, but also part of the excesses are about Antifa. I mean, Glenn was out there complaining that The Intercept, apparently reported on these reporters who go on Fox News all the time. The idea is that there's this sort of like vague pushback on the notion of police reform. I mean, is ultimately what it is. Yeah, there are some people out there who want to abolish the police department, but certainly Krasner is not somebody who's saying abolish the police department. He's talking about, massive reform and reorientation of this money. And it is it's all part of this, where the mainstream media wants to sort of like at least do a head nod to that concept, and it dovetails with sort of more conservative elements in society. And then they just knee-jerk make these stories that are obviously had to have been based on absolutely nothing, because you look at the numbers.
I think that just generally speaking in America, we have a very punitive idea about what it means to have a legal system. And we have a very kinetic idea about what policing means. A lot of people are indoctrinated to believe that if police aren't out there cracking skulls, making arrests, like breaking down doors, crime is going to be rampant. And so the idea, like that Emma said, that like the rise in crime of all types during the pandemic might be due to a rise in desperation, and that the solution to that rise in desperation, which we can contextualize as just being part of the American experience for a rapidly growing part of the population, is to increase and expand social safety services. But a lot of these articles seem to be implying, based on like whole cloth, that the solution is more policing, harder punitive measures to decrease the amount of crime that we're seeing, which we just know doesn't work. Like, we know that like people are not deterred by increasing the punishment or like by throwing more police at the problem. We know that the way to solve these problems is the way other countries have solved these problems, by like on the front end de-incentivizing crime as something people need to do out of desperation.
Yeah, and I don't even know that it's necessarily like it is really just sort of dealing with societal ills, and the process in which crime develops out of that is, I think, is complicated, but I think it is addressing societal ills and really, incentivizing people for, to be more engaged, in a less violent way with society is basically what it seems to come down to.
It's also funny that the posture has to be the liberal media is silencing these working class concerns about, the safety of their neighborhoods, where if you look at who's trying to recall Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, it's all these venture capital people who have like moderate in their bio, like donut Twitter, right? So it's pretty clear who's really concerned, and it's rich liberals in the city, basically.
Yeah, I wonder how that narrative comes to be, right? It's rich liberals who have connections to the donor class, who are intertwined with the nonprofit think tank liberal sector in DC, which drives a lot more of what comes out of these papers than I think people realize.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of what people, at these papers look at as like a sign of crime rising is, more homeless people on the street that they have to walk past that make them uncomfortable, especially during the pandemic where like more people are eating outside. It was only a few months ago that we saw a few articles coming out in some of these same publications about how homeless people were accosting people outside who were eating, or how BLM protesters were accosting people outside while eating. So a lot of this relates to like their feeling of comfort in these spaces that are now a lot more public. And so, the lack of integration that we have, where so many people have been left, homeless and economically deprived by this pandemic and the many things before this pandemic, it just creates this space, especially in places like San Francisco, where, the editor of Mother Jones has to walk down and feel like she's walking through a slum in Bangladesh. I forget what the exact quote is. And so, a lot of people, I think, especially in these quote unquote liberal bastions, want to put forth this sort of image of perfection that necessarily requires culling the parts of our population that we just let fall through the cracks.
And really quick, just that's the consequence of labor unions losing power as an organizing force on the left in Washington, and it becoming these think tanks that are populated by college-educated, wealthy liberals, in my view.
And I want to say that, like, I strongly believe that there are resources within the that there are areas where the police are needed to do like a better job. Like there's certain investigations and in violent crimes that happen that the police don't address in some ways. But so this is it seems to me more about a story of wanting to push back against a narrative of any type of, reform or diminishment of police's role in society, and this sort of, I think there are different constituencies who sign on to that perspective, and the anti, whatever it is, BLM, or the anti-Antifa or whatever it is perspective. It sort of feels like, when Paul Wolfowitz said, weapons of mass destruction was the one thing we could all agree on, because you had a bunch of different people who had a bunch of different agendas for going into Iraq. I think that's the same thing that's going on with this. So for some people, this is a way to, show their bona fides that they're not, too far left. And for others, it's like their way of like trying to criticize this sort of, millennial culture of that encompasses these different movements.
And discipline them for naivete.
Yeah.
I agree, Sam. And I think what's always striking when you talk about the police, whether it's abolition or reform or just the police generally, whenever they're in the news, is how little Americans actually know about what the police actually do in this country. Like, people speak to crime statistics like 40% rise in homicide. But if you actually like talking about like how many crimes police actually solve, or like how many crimes police actually commit, how much is stolen through civil asset forfeiture from communities of color, how many people are shot every year who are mentally disabled, who are veterans, or even just the fact that a lot of the things that they think police do are largely handled by other people because police don't do that. Like, I had a conversation with somebody who was surprised that like the fire department does and can, investigate arson. And it's like, yeah, because it's like, I think that there is a discrepancy, a huge discrepancy in what people think the police do and are for, and what purpose they can serve for people, like you said, symbolically within our, punitive media culture. But the big problem with that is that they're actually tethered to a force that's incredibly destructive. And so talking about them like they actually, solve crimes and do the things they do on Law and Order creates this very false picture, I think, in people's minds that is rapidly crumbling after actually watching police like crack skulls. Right. And it becomes less about police reform and police abolition and much more about like, well, the police certainly aren't doing the things that I think they're doing.